So hello, hello, so glad you can make it. Take a seat, get comfy, because we're about to get started. So to start out with, who exactly am I? Well, simply, my name is Brandon. I recently started at Gusto as a principal engineer on the service modularization team, and like doing all manner of fun things to Ruby and explaining them later using a series of illustrated cartoon lemurs. Which brings me to this talk today. So how about we skip the rest of that and go ahead and get started then. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with our adventurous young lemur, let's take a quick look back. So this is Red the lemur. And Red, he's gone on quite a few adventures over the years in programming through many, many different stories. It all started years ago with Reducing Innumerable, a tale of a student Red as he journeyed through the lands of Innumerable to learn the powers of Reduce from several wise masters. And then it went on to a story of operations and capacity planning during the holiday seasons and scaling Christmas. And there was that one time he showed up to conduct a symphony orchestra at RailsConf using the audience's cell phones and WebSockets in the Action Cable Symphony. Then on to an adventure deep in the depths of the darkest magics of the Ruby programming language with the Dark Lord Crimson, the Ruby Grimoire, which puts us right back in time for Christmas for the Night Before Code Freeze, where we took the Night Before Christmas and gave it a fun little new twist. To the talk that's yet to be given, involving a certain time-traveling lemur from RailsConf 2020 that I had to unfortunately drop, but may resubmit again in the future. And then returning with stories around the archetypes of expertise, how to apply them to teams, mental health, and other such matters in the experts, with a slight detour to discussing pattern matching using poker, and finally landing us at this last talk at RubyConf with a few delightfully fashionable lemurs in decorating Ruby, which we'll be taking a look at today. So, sufficient to say, our friend Red has gone on quite a few adventures over the years, and I hope they'll have the chance to go on many more. So, what exactly goes into a talk like one of Red's adventures? Well, to start out with, we need to build a foundation. And the first part of that process, for me, is the story. You see, art's great, but what really brings together a story, and I love a good story, is a triumph, a victory, a challenge, a task to overcome, a lesson to be learned. A good story can transport us to another world, give us wings to fly, and let our imagination soar, and it awakens such creativity and possibility in our minds, it gives us hope. Stories have this wondrous power to ground abstract ideas in reality that you might not have thought possible before. And for me, every good talk starts with one of those stories, and every picture helps me tell that story. It could be over anything, and frequently I have a story before I even have a technical concept I want to discuss. Perhaps a detective noir, maybe a musical, getting lost while traveling, well, maybe even a trip to Wonderland or even space and time itself. There's no real limit to the amount of stories that can be told. The easiest stories are those which are thematic, such as date time maybe being tied to something like Doctor Who, or sea extensions tied to a pirate seafaring adventure with a few sea shanties thrown in for fun, because why not? What can you get away with? That's kind of the challenge by this point. Now, the nice thing is sometimes those themes can help you refine your competencies and guide example code into something more concrete and give audiences something to grasp onto. Perhaps the story is even that I went to RailsConf in a tuxedo a couple of years ago to conduct a symphony orchestra on the audience's cell phones to play Beethoven's Sixth. Now, there are a lot of things you can get away with here if you have a good story to tell and a good CFP to sell it. Now, stories are well and good, but these are programming conferences with serious programming people that are incredibly serious about programming things. I mean, just look at me. I'm a bastion of seriousness. I have been for years. Now, jokes aside, how is it I go about choosing a technical subject to weave a tale around? Well, there are just a few things I keep an eye on. The first of which is I like to look at the current zeitgeist, or mood of the day, if you will. Perhaps even the Zeitwork. Now, before Xavier's talk, I thought approximately 5 people in the audience are going to get that, so thank you very much for introducing that. And also my apologies to him and Alanchon. Now, say you have an idea or two which tech you want to focus on. It's not quite that easy. There are some topics I'd love to cover, monads, but they would be far too complicated to get through in a talk. Now, there are some which aren't complicated enough, though I find that isn't quite as much a concern as being too complicated. Entry topics are very well received most of the time, and not everyone at a conference is super senior, so they're always very useful to people. Speaking of complexity, though, you have to remember, you have 30 minutes, maybe 40 if you're lucky, and that's much, much less time than you'd think, because there's only so much content you can put in a talk. And when paired with some of the complexity of the technical subjects you're trying to approach, there are a few rules that I keep in mind when going for this. The first of which is the rule of 3. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say we had 3 main competencies, A, B, and C, all related to a single topic. Any more, it's hard to fit into the allotted time, and your audience retains information. Any less, and it's going to feel like that talk is dragging. Frequently, each of these sections builds upon the last, where the final one kind of ties everything together before going into the outro. And I found that 3 is probably about the best balance. Sometimes I go a little bit more, a little bit less, but this is typically what I go for. The second rule I look at is 5-20-5. And what do I mean by that? Well, 5 minutes for the introduction to the story and setting the stage, 20 minutes on the core technologies, and 5 minutes on the outro to tie it all together. Now, I don't always strictly follow, but oftentimes I get close. If it's a 40-minute talk, I expand that. This lets me lead into subjects, introduce concepts, and even hint at additional lessons in the outro, as well as other resources. Though, if you spend a solid 20 minutes on code, it's going to be really hard to follow, so oftentimes I'll sneak in little breaks, expositions, jokes, and/or otherwise. Maybe even a convenient drink of water just to give myself a few seconds. Lovely prop devices those are. So now we have the tech, we have the story, and as with any software work, the next thing we're going to need to do is have a plan on how in the world we're going to turn this into reality, because that's a lot of work. Now, we start with the CFP outline, which is the skeleton. It's the core and the central tenet of your talk. If you have the tech, your 3 competencies, and the story, you'll find this is a lot easier than it might have been if you try and start from the CFP itself. And that's why we start with the foundation first. Now, the abstract in the CFP is perhaps the hardest single thing for me to write, because you're trying to distill an entire talk, the essence of everything you want to communicate, in 1 or 2 paragraphs. And that is extremely difficult. It sets the tone of the talk and is perhaps the piece that's most likely to sell everyone on your talk and get them interested in the first place. And that applies to both attendees and the CFP reviewers. It's your hook, your introduction to the magic, the story to be told. It's a window into your imagination, so make sure to polish it well. Oftentimes, a good abstract takes me several hours over the course of weeks to land. It's never been a short process, which is why I always lead with that thought. But the abstract is going to most certainly be influenced by who exactly the audience is that I wish to reach. Now, let's say we have an introductory talk. It has an extremely wide audience, applies to many people in the conference, but might not quite be as interesting to an intermediate or advanced audience. So especially at somewhere like RubyConf, where the audience tends to be far more beginner, you're going to have a lot bigger of an audience. So be aware when you're presenting what the typical makeup is at that conference. An intermediate talk, on the other hand, might elide some introductory information, making it harder for new members to actually follow what's going on, but it can dive a lot deeper into novel techniques. Now, for RailsConf, these talks tend to take center stage, as there's a lot of assumed knowledge here. And going by the Rails Community Survey from 2020, a vast majority of respondents are actually in that middle category of about 4 to 9 years experience. Now, an advanced talk, it's the one everyone wants to give, the one everyone thinks they want to give, but it's also by and far the most difficult and by and far the smallest percentage of the entire conference, unless you're targeting somewhere like Ruby Kaigi, which is very used to that type of thing. Now, the problem is, if it's such a small percentage, you're aiming at a very, very small target. Even if you have the most amazing talk in the world, you're going up against some really, really interesting people. And completely fair, it also means trying to get it accepted is going to be difficult. Now, in any case, remember, you can't be all things to all people. You need to pick an audience, what trade-offs you're willing to make in communicating that subject, and how exactly you intend to reach them. Because if you try and reach everyone, you're going to reach no one, including the CFP reviewers. Now, then comes the outline, where you expand on the skeleton of the talk and what you intend to cover in each section. Now, it can serve as either a well-drawn map or a difficult trudge. Now, personally, I try not to bind myself too tightly to this, as it tends to change as the talk comes together. As long as the core concepts are there, the rest will follow. The rule of 3 helps me focus a lot on what I want to do here, as well as 5-25 to bookend the core technology concepts with the story to tie it all together. Which brings us to the last section, which would be the pitch. It's the final cell of the talk, and for me, where I explain some of the thinking behind what may not be fully obvious in the rest of the CFP. Now, that said, the more that's not obvious, the more trouble I'm likely to get in with the reviewers. Because personally, as a previous reviewer of some of the CFPs here, a pitch is the last thing I'm going to see when I'm reading through things, so I need to be sold on it much further up the page in something like the abstract. The talk should stand on its own by this point, and the pitch should be used for final clarifications rather than absorbing all the content which probably belongs in other sections. But that rounds out the CFP process. Now, the reason I spend so long on the outline, though, it's a skeleton that really drives and storyboards my talk. Around now, I get out a stack of index cards, set a timer up with repeats on 5 minutes, and sketch out each of what stage of the story, what I'd like it to look like. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to really come together. The point is to get ideas on paper and to force myself to actually visualize the talk instead of obsessing over the minute details of that. It may turn out to be a horrid idea. I may rearrange everything. I may completely change my outline at this phase, but this definitely does help me refine my talk down. And these are a small portion of the cards from the most recent talk. Sometimes I say true, other times I go in a completely different direction. Now, the big thing is keeping track of what exactly are you doing. And for me, I use all these Google spreadsheets to try and keep them going. So what I do is I turn each step from the individual sketch to eventually the slide it ends up on. I use this to heavily budget my time and try and see how much I'm signed up for. Sometimes that helps me see if I'm going way overboard, and it'll get me to drop art or some sections of the story to make this more realistic. Now, you might notice there in the corner that that has 100 hours of a time commitment. I am not joking. I wish I were. And this is also not the entire spreadsheet. Now, sufficient to say that does take a little bit. Which brings me to a very, very important point. If you get nothing else out of this talk, I want you to hear this one point. Don't overcommit. Now, I'm decent at guessing how long a piece is going to take me, but that comes from a lot of practice and a lot of years of working on this. Be careful if you're not calibrated here, because things take much, much longer than you think. And that takes significantly more time than you can imagine. Focus on the core of your talk, getting the core message through, and then add the flourishes, then add the icing, then add all the fun things on top of it, because otherwise you're going to find yourself very, very unpleasantly surprised a couple weeks before the conference. And to do that, and when I say plan, I mean down to the day. Make sure you're not signing yourself up for 5 hours of art or something like that the week before the conference, because that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. And know what you're signing up for, and trim that down from your initial plan, because I've not done that in the past, and it comes back to haunt me. You don't want a crash landing the week before the conference where you're trying to bring this all together. Which brings me to the fun part, creating the lemurs themselves and some of the art around that. Now, initially, in the old days, I'd use pencil and paper for a lot of this. And I'd start everything in a sketch pad before scanning it. And by scanning it, I mean I would literally take my phone, take pictures of it, and then put that on my iPad, because resolution really didn't matter. Hacky, yes. Works, also yes. Congratulations, welcome to programming. Anyway, point being, with fashionable lemurs, I made a very interesting jump where I decided that I was going to go for the first time full digital and try and do this completely on the iPad without touching paper, except for those index cards, because that's an old habit which isn't going to die anytime soon. So one thing I'd always use is a matte screen protector to try and make it feel more like I was drawing on paper, because otherwise my Apple Pencil would be sliding all around the iPad and I would have a lot of difficulty. Now, the new version of the iPad made this a lot easier, along with that matte screen protector, to actually get things done. And as far as applications, this was one of the first talks I'd done with the lemurs, and the application I'd originally used was Adobe Illustrator Draw, but eventually that program was deprecated in favor of what I currently use and what this last talk was drawn in, which is Adobe Fresco, its successor. Both allow me to use vector artwork, which is very, very useful when I want to make stickers, scale things up or down, and I'm not really sure what the proportions are. I mean, honestly, you could even do something as crazy as, say, make a giant cutout of a cartoon lemur. Surprisingly affordable, by the way, but very difficult to transport back and forth to conferences. I don't think poor Red here survived the flights. Anyways, I digress. Back to tools. Now, let's take a brief look at a simplified version of Red, step by step on how I approach them. If you note the timestamps on the screenshot, it's because I kept locking my iPad while trying to take them, because I'm slightly clumsy. But normally this takes me around 10 to 15 minutes for a simple character. So I start from a blank canvas with a vector brush over here, which is how I scale things up to literally lemur-sized cutouts if I really wanted to. And I have a set of swatches that I tend to use, and most of the time I carry over traditional habits from mediums like, say, blue pencils, in that I use blue to set out my initial sketch. Now this allows me to see a little bit more clearly from the black inking or other phases of this. So I start from a set of basic shapes. A circle for the head, 3 circles inside for, say, the eyes and the mouth, maybe a triangle for the hat, triangle for the body, a couple of triangles for the arms and legs. These are all very basic shapes and very fundamental building blocks that anyone could really do. And that gives you a foundation you could do a lot of things with. Now, from there, I create a new layer and start inking, by which I mean I start filling it out with black ink to try and get the drawing to an outline. The blue lines don't need to be exact as much as they need to give me a vague idea of what exactly it is I'm trying to create and get ideas on paper. Once that base outline is done, I fill in areas which I know are going to be solid black or solid white, as I don't want other colors overlapping them. Then I hide the blue layer and duplicate the outline. I'll show you why in a moment, but I fill in on the bottom duplicate outline layer for colors. So what I do here is I start with color blocking, and I use the hue, saturation, brightness levels over there, which is one of my absolute favorite tools to use in this application. In which case, say I want it a little bit more towards orange and a bit darker for this yellow tone over here, or rather for the orange of the outfit. Now after that, it's time to start shading things in. And the cheat I typically use is I don't color in the entire thing. I draw the outlines of where the shadows are going to go, use the hue, saturation, brightness sliders to drop, say, let's say 5 or 10%, and then I fill that in to take care of the rest. Frequently, I'll also use a color dropper, which gives me each tone from around the image to grab a color, and then I modify it back in those same levels, drop it, say, 6 to 10%, whatever sounds about right. Honestly, I mostly wing this rule of thumb. So if you ever notice, no, the shading is not consistent through the slides, I'll eventually fix that. Now, one interesting trick is I don't just modify the saturation for shading colors, I also modify the hue a hair. Now, what do I mean by that? I take the gold tone and I move it just a little bit over there to the left for the orange and take off a little bit of brightness. My rule of thumb here is that for shades, I pick a warmer hue, which kind of warms up the image and brings it a little bit more to ground, and cooler for the highlights with less saturation to make them a little bit more crisp and distinct. Now, I also try and blend things in with shading where possible to kind of make those transitions look right. So why the duplicate outline? Well, quite frankly, because I'm lazy. I don't like coloring inside the lines. I never really have. It's been a problem since kindergarten, and they never really fixed me. Now, it lets me cheat because I can draw and only sort of get close to it and then fill in the rest. Now, after that, I tend to hide the background and add layers to a group, which you might see there on the right, which contains the outline, the coloring, and the blue line, which I have hidden, and that lets me manipulate all these layers as a single step. So let's say I don't like all the blank space there. I drew too close to the bottom. Let's center it up and make that bigger. And there we go. That should about do it. Now, you might also know, if you played with Fresco before, it has this lovely little feature called export to time-lapse. And I frequently use that to show some of my process, but unfortunately it doesn't show which tools I use and some of the information I use on color and shading, which is why we went through the last section. Altogether, that produces something which looks a little bit like this, which is the entire process sped up in one go. Now, I really do envy this because I wish I could draw that quickly, but it's not going to happen. And that brings us to a complete lemur. If you'd like me to do that live, I will more than happily do it afterwards, but I'm trying to run on a budget of time, so we'll make sure we behave ourselves up here. But that's just a character. How exactly do I have so many and organize all of that? Because there are 200 plus slides in any one of these talks with multiple scenes, multiple characters, and all this various stuff going on. There's a lot. So how exactly do I work with backgrounds? Well, let's take a look into Creative Cloud real quick. In this particular talk, I only have 7 actual distinct scenes, where some of those are just that I made the background a little bit darker. Except there's so many different pieces mentioned. The trick, a lot of scenes, and a lot of layers. So it takes me a while to name all these, but it's definitely worth the effort in the long run in managing complexity of what's going on. In this single file, I actually have 9 slides, some of which more primarily involve graying out characters that aren't actively speaking or separating foregrounds from the backgrounds. So let's take a look at this particular build. We start out with the background, and very subtly, you might see it happen here, the foreground right there, so I can put characters behind it and have them come up into the scene. And then I'll add characters into the foreground, into the background, and each of those are distinct entities, which means I can move them around, use Keynote animations, or do anything else I want, which is me getting dangerously close to animation, which I really shouldn't do. I already spend enough time on these things. But that brings me to a principal rule of all this. Be lazy. Reuse things. I used to not do this. I redrew 68 slides from beginning to end in my first conference, and it took me way the heck too long. I would not recommend that for anyone, nor would I endorse it. In fact, I'm so lazy now. Let's take a look at this slide. Now, how do you think I approach something like that? Because those who know me know I absolutely hate perspective. I'm horrible at it. I've tried books, I've tried everything, and I'm just not good at it. Maybe I just need to practice more, or maybe I just need to play more Minecraft, because that's 100% what it was. You see, this is a beautiful, beautiful cheat for this because I get 3-point perspective for free, except for all the time building the buildings, but we won't talk about that. For free, for free. Let's focus on the nice part here. Now, I take that base, I trace over it, add some embellishments, and go from there. Let's see ourselves real quick. Now, I start from the base, I trace, and try and get an idea of what exactly I want to do. You'll notice I embellish the trees, the clock tower there, and some of the buildings, as well as add mountains. Then I go in, and I start outlining everything to get an idea of where exactly everything lays there. Now, I'm also hiding a lot of these layers, so it's not nearly as convoluted as it looks here. After that, I start filling in the color blocking, and eventually start adding shading, a little bit of mood lighting there in the background, some embellishments, decorations, and other things. And eventually, I start getting to the characters in the foreground, and then finally add some ambient lighting to give myself a final piece. Now, all in all, that illustration took me probably 5 to 6 hours, so not cheap. I really wish I could draw that fast, though. Wouldn't that be nice? So let's get into the keynote, the slides, and the delivery. Now let's start with how I organize slides. You see, all those presentations have a lot of slides, and as I mentioned before, sometimes into the 200 slide mark. Keynote lets you conveniently nest slides and minimize them into groups, which is great for sections, subsections, and add infin to them to try and keep track of everything, because as soon as you get to that number of slides, it's very hard to keep track of when the world's going on. If you're trying to scroll up and down and edit sections, good luck. I've tried before. It's a bad idea. Which brings me to the next fun part, which is how do you exactly go about coding Keynote? Now, you might have recognized this one from the past talk where we're talking about prepending a module. And there are a few things going on with the slide, but let's start with the structure. How exactly do I lay out that code in the slide, and what exactly is going on here? Because there are a lot of things. Starting with the left bar here, there are 4 things going on. The first is the title up there to the left, which lets people know, especially those watching the video later, what exact section I happen to be in and what we're covering. Sometimes that might include subtitles for sections which are particularly long and or convoluted. Now, the next is the focal character. Oftentimes, each section has a core character which is technically presenting it, and I have one specific lemur teaching to give visual contrast between the sections. The background of that slide is also tied to whatever color that lemur happens to be. So an orange lemur will have an orange background, yellow, yellow, blue, blue, and so on and so forth. And the next, and new in my last talk, is a subsection count. Think of it as a page number that helps further distinguish between where we are in a presentation. It's also a lovely little sheet to remind me whether or not I'm going way too fast or way too slow. And then the last is my Twitter handle so people can find more information, as I frequently post resources over there. All these together make it easier in both video afterwards and from any photo that happens to be taken during the conference to find exactly which section it is I'm mentioning when someone takes a photo. Now, the left section is fun, but the right section is where a lot of the magic happens. So my first cheat is there's quite literally an invisible rectangle drawn right there. Why do I do this? Because that lets me divide sections and actually center inside of that shape, which is really, really handy if you want to partition slides into subsections. It has alignment guides and a lot of other things. Otherwise, I'm guessing, and if those things are a few pixels out of alignment, it's going to bother me for days and weeks afterwards. Anyways, back to what the code's doing. I love to use Magic Move to draw a focus here. In this case, in part of the talk, I want to show the module first and then the class that prepended it. Notice that the colors are different on the talk method in both the prepended module and the class. This is intentional, and it's a superset of syntax highlighting that I tend to call concept highlighting, which gives a little bit more information as to exactly which part of the code is pertaining to which section we're talking about. So one common trick I use here to draw focus is to gray out sections I'm not currently talking about. And it lets you focus your eye down the page, which draws you to the lemur.new.talk. And notice how that method is in red rather than green, meaning it comes from the Talkable module rather than the lemur class. Now, I do use some other focal tricks just to try and work better with color blindness, as that is something I need to get better at. And if I ever get that wrong, absolutely feel free to mention it to me. So back on that, though, you'll notice I use graying to highlight the talk method is coming from the prepended module here rather than the class. I can also use that to show additions to that method and show how the data is exactly flowing through each step of it. And sometimes I'll use pseudo Ruby to say this is the value it is in this section of the code as you're calling around it. Now, some might ask the magic trick I use to highlight this, and unfortunately this is one case where I break my own rule, which is I do it all by hand and I should probably really stop. Now, I could use VS Code for this, sure, but remember concept highlighting is a superset, which means this isn't quite as easy as I'd like it to be. Now, for a quick interlude, for those of you who remember, I do cartoon voices along with my talks. Let's take this keyboard for a demonstration real quick. So lay out a few octaves or 8 notes for reference, and then give them numbers from 0 to 5, where 0 is really, really low, growly, bass type of voice, and 5 is really, really high soprano. Now, there are more, but this will do right now for an example. So somehow I was blessed with a voice which can go from about F# 0 all the way to A4 up there in blue. And for those of you who've heard me sing at karaoke, I have quite a range that I can play with here, which is very, very handy. I spent years duplicating cartoons, voices, and everything else I could get a hold of. Now, you see here when I'm singing, I'm typically between bass and baritone, which is 1 to 3, with the ability to do tenor for a limited time. But if I'm just speaking and imitating character voices, I can get away with a lot more here, because fours wreck my voice very quickly. So you notice none of the main characters have a voice 4 or above, because I'm really, really cautious not to manage to lose my voice. I can eke out a few notes either side of this by growl or falsetto, but it still gives me a lot of range from something which might be, say, very deep, to something which might be very, very high and more magic and ephemeral. Now, it turns out mimicking cartoon voice as a kid came in a lot of handy. Who would have known? Anyway, that brings me to one of the last sections, which is timing is key. And by that, I mean practice a lot. It means run through your talk from start to finish several times, writing down anything unusual you happen to see. You'll be surprised at how much you catch each time you go through things. And if you can, be sure to arrange a dry run, because if you're only looking at the slide transitions, you'll miss the speaker notes. If you're only looking at the speaker notes, you'll miss the slide transitions. And there's so much into a talk where one little mistake, you're probably going to be the only one who notices it, sure, but you're still going to notice, and it's still going to annoy you for the next week. So I like to make sure I don't do this if at all possible. Now, for me, I like to run through a talk about 10 to 15 times before I give it live. Now, slide notes are also very crucial for me, as they help me pace myself and keep to a core theme rather than getting carried away in examples. There have been a few times where I've winged it, sure, but this helps me get the timing right, which brings me to my next point, and one of the best things that I've ever discovered from someone teaching me about conferences, which is checkpoints. Now, as I'm running on a dry run, I have a sheet of paper to my right to where I'm writing down exactly which point and exactly which time I'm hitting each major section. And I run this about 3 times to get an average of that and say, okay, I'm running at about 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes here, and I need to cut about 1 minute worth of content, which helps me know as I'm going through the talk, because I put those in the slide notes, I'm going way too fast, I'm going way too slow, I need to speed up, I need to slow down, maybe insert a joke here, maybe a sip of water, who knows. But with 30 minutes, time management is so crucial to actually delivering one of these talks. Now, combining this with 5-25, which is the rule of 5 minutes of story, 20 minutes of content, and 5 minutes of outro, and the rule of 3 helps me keep this on track. And normally, if anything, I make up time on the outro and come pretty close to that 30-minute mark. But really, above all, have fun. I mean, the point of these talks is to spread joy, wonder, inspire others to new possibilities, and allow others to dream and go beyond what we ourselves might imagine possible. Don't constrain yourself to what's strictly speaking professional or important. Share your joy. Share what gives you life. That's what it means to be in the Ruby communities. We're allowed to share joy. We're allowed to share what makes us happy, what gives us that life. And I look forward to seeing yours one day. So to wrap up then, it's been quite a bit of fun over these last 4 or 5 years giving Lemur talks, and perhaps many more to come. You can find me on these various social networks, or feel free to follow along on anything else. And as always, before I finish this talk, thank you to so many people who helped me over the years, from reviewing slides, reviewing drawings, to putting up with my random ideas I message you at 2 a.m. in the morning. Thank you so much for your time there. But with that, we'll call it good and say, Ven.